Chapter 8. Wally came home for Thanksgiving. Candy had been home for several weekends in the early fall, but Homer had not known how to see her without Wally. Wally was surprised that Homer and Candy hadn't seen each other, and, from Candy's embarrassment with Wally's surprise, Homer detected that she had also wanted a meeting with him. But the turkey was ready, the table was set, and Olive was happy to have a full house again. There was no time to feel embarrassed. Homer volunteered to carve the turkey. He did such a good job that Olive said, "You should be a surgeon, Homer." Wally laughed and Ray Kendall said, "The boy's just good with his hands." If you've got good hands, if you do a thing, your hands won't forget how? That's like you, Ray, Olive said, which moved the attention away from Homer's work with the knife. He carved every bit of meat off the bones as quickly as possible. Wally talked about the war. He said he'd thought about dropping out of college to go to flying school. So if there is a war, if we get into it, then I'll already know how to fly. You won't do such a thing, Olive said to him. Why do you want to do such a thing? Candy asked him. I think you're selfish. What do you mean, selfish? Wally asked. A war is for your country, it's serving your country. To you, it's an adventure, Candy said. You won't do such a thing, anyway, Olive repeated. I was too young to go to the last war, Ray said, and if there's another one, I'll be too old. Lucky you. Olive said. That's right, Candy said. Ray shrugged. I don't know, he said. I wanted to go to the last one. I even tried to lie about my age. Now you know better, Olive said. I'm not so sure of that, Ray said. If there's the new one, there'll be lots of new weapons, they're building things which you can't even imagine. I try to imagine it, Wally said. I imagine the war all the time. Except the dying, Wally, Olive Worthington said, carrying the turkey carcass out to the kitchen. I don't think you've imagined the dying. Right, said Homer Wells, who imagined the dying all the time. Candy looked at him and smiled. Why didn't you visit me on the weekends, Homer? She said. Yeah, why didn't you? Wally asked him. Were you too busy with Deborah Pettigrew? Homer just shook his head. He was too busy with the practical anatomy of the rabbit. Olive called from the kitchen. The what? Wally said. But Olive was wrong. After 3 weeks of senior biology, Homer realized that he knew more about the animal and its relation to human anatomy than his teacher, Mr. Hood. Soon Homer received a letter from Dr. Larch. "My dear Homer," wrote Dr. Larch, "the Board of Trustees is attempting to communicate with several former residents of Street Clouds in the form of a ridiculous questionnaire. Answer it, please. And you must be prepared for some other, more troubling correspondence from them. It was necessary for me to be frank with them about the health of the orphans. Although I saw no reason to tell them I had lost Fuzzy Stone to a respiratory ailment, I told the board about your heart. I felt that if anything ever happened to me, there should be someone who knew. I apologize for not telling you about your condition. I am telling you now because I would never want you to hear about your heart from someone else first. Now, don't be alarmed. I would not even describe the problem. You had a heart murmur as a small child, but this had almost entirely disappeared when I last checked you, in your sleep. I have delayed even saying about your heart to you because I didn't want to worry you needlessly. Please don't worry. If you're interested in more details, I can provide them. For now, I just didn't want you to become upset by some foolish thing you might hear from that Board of Trustees. Please avoid any situation of extreme stress. Anyway, I want you to know that you can almost certainly lead a normal life. A normal life? Thought Homer Wells. I am in love with my best friend's girlfriend, but is that what Larch would call extreme stress? He liked the life at Ocean View. He wanted candy, and some life with her. When she went back to Camden, he tried not to think about her, and since he could not think of Wally without thinking of candy, he was relieved when Wally went back to Orono, although he had missed Wally all that fall. When an orphan is depressed, wrote Wilbur Larch, he is attracted to telling lies. A lie keeps you on your toes by making you suddenly responsible for what happens because of it. You must keep your lie a secret. Orphans are not the masters of their fates. But when you lie, it makes you feel in charge of your life. Telling lies is very seductive to orphans. I know, Dr. Larch wrote. I know because I tell them, too. I love to lie. When you lie, you feel as if you have cheated fate. And so Homer Wells answered the questionnaire. He sang a hymn of praise to Street Clouds. He wrote about the restoration of the abandoned buildings of Street Clouds as one of the many attempts to integrate the daily life of the orphanage with the life of the surrounding community. He wrote with calmness to Dr. Larch. He would appreciate further details about his heart disease. Did Dr. Larch think it necessary, for example, for Homer to have monthly checkups? Dr. Larch would think it unnecessary, of course. And were there ways that he could listen for his murmur? Stay calm, Dr. Larch would advise. One weekend in December, Candy came home from Camden and Homer's confusion about her increased. On the weekends when she came home, she took the train, then Ray drove her back, on Sunday. I'll visit her tomorrow, on Saturday, Homer thought. Homer saw Candy the next day. When she said that she wanted to see the Fred Astaire movie, which was on in Bath, Homer had no objections. I always wanted to see him, he said. Bath, after all, was less than an hour away. Homer and Candy had not found the Italian restaurant in Bath that Ray had recommended. They'd eaten some pizza in the van and had arrived at the movie early. At the ticket booth, Candy said that she would like to take a walk and Homer agreed. They turned away from the theater and walked downhill to the Kennebec. Candy faced the river and leaned against Homer Wells. He had never said the words, "I am in love with you." What he felt was only love, but what he thought he felt was his heart. It was difficult to breathe. He put both his hands to his chest. Candy turned to him and saw his face. "Is it your heart?" Candy asked him. "Oh God, you don't have to say anything, please don't even think about it." "My heart," he said. "Do you know about my heart?" "Don't worry," Candy said. "I love you," Homer Wells whispered. "Yes, I know, don't think about it," Candy said. "Don't worry about anything. I love you, too." "You do?" he asked. "Yes, yes, and Wally too," she said. "I love you and I love Wally, don't worry about it, don't even think about it." "How do you know about my heart?" asked Homer Wells. "We all know about it," Candy said. "Olive knows, and Wally knows." Homer Wells felt his heart race out of control again. "Don't think about your heart, Homer," Candy said, hugging him tightly. "Don't worry about me, or Wally." "What should I think about?" asked Homer Wells. "Only good things," Candy told him. "Good things," said Homer Wells, holding the girl of his dreams. It was not a night for a musical. "We can see Fred Astaire dance another time," Candy said philosophically. They drove the van back to Heart's Haven. Nobody who knew them saw them come or go. Candy and Homer sat with their backs against opposite corner posts at the end of the dock. They could touch each other with the soles of their feet, but Candy sat with her knees slightly bent. "Is it okay?" Candy asked quietly. "Is what okay?" he asked. "Your heart," she whispered. How could he tell? "I guess so," he said. "It'll be okay," she said. "What will be okay?" asked Homer Wells. Everything, Candy said hurriedly. Everything, repeated Homer Wells. I love you, that's okay. And you love me, and Wally, that's okay, too? Right, he said. You have to wait and see, Candy said. Right. I don't know what to do, either, said Candy helplessly. We have to do the right thing, Homer Wells said. Wally wants to do the right thing, and Dr. Larch was doing what he thought was the right thing, too. If you could be patient enough to wait and see, the right thing must come itself, mustn't it? What else does an orphan do, anyway, but wait and see? I can be patient, said Homer Wells. Olive Worthington looked at the clock on her night table and turned out her reading lamp. Homer never stayed out so late with Deborah Pettigrew, she thought. Olive didn't imagine Candy's attraction to Homer Wells. Olive had the greatest respect for Homer's diligence. She had seen him be a better student than Wally had ever been, and she knew he was a reliable and friendly companion, too. Well, thank goodness, they are three nice people, she said aloud, and her own voice in the empty house surprised her and completely woke her up. Some hot chocolate would be soothing, she thought, and when Homer comes home, he can have some with her. Soon Homer came home. She heard the van in the driveway and she called him. How's Candy? Olive asked at the table. Fine, said Homer Wells. They sipped their hot chocolate, like mother and son, both of them were thinking, and, at the same time, not like mother and son, they both thought. And how are you? Olive asked him, after a while. Just fine, said Homer Wells, but what he thought was, I'm going to wait and see. On Sunday evening, Candy was returning to Camden with her father. Raymond Kendall was especially proud of the radio reception he had engineered for his Chevrolet. Candy and her father heard the news as soon as anyone in Maine heard it, and they heard it loud and clear. Olive always had the radio on, and so she was one of those people who needed to hear things several times before she really heard them. She was baking an apple pie, and only the unusual urgency in the announcer's voice caused her to pay attention to the radio at all. Homer Wells was in Wally's room, reading David Copperfield and thinking about Candy when Olive interrupted him. Homer! Olive called upstairs. Where is Pearl Harbor? Homer Wells didn't know where Pearl Harbor was, he also didn't know what it was. I don't know. He called downstairs. Well, the Japanese have just bombed it. Olive called to him. Do you mean, with planes? Asked Homer Wells. From the sky? Of course from the sky. Olive shouted. come here and listen to this. Where is Pearl Harbor? Candy asked her father, said Raymond Kindle. If we just listen, maybe they'll say. Young Wally Worthington, who wanted so much to be a hero, danced out on the streets of Orono, where he heard the news. Wally wanted to fly a B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber, 4 engines, used for bombing bridges, fuel depots, railroad tracks, and so forth. People in Hearts Haven and in Hearts Rock always said that Wally had everything: money, looks, goodness, charm, the girl of his dreams, but he had courage, too, and he had youth's most dangerous qualities: optimism and restlessness. He would risk everything he had to fly the plane that could carry the bomb. Wally joined the Army Air Corps before Christmas, but they allowed him to spend Christmas at home. It would take the Army Air Corps more than a year to teach Wally the arts of aerial warfare. By that time, he told Olive and Candy in the kitchen at Ocean View, all the fighting will probably be over. That would be just my luck. That would be lucky, Olive said. Candy nodded her head. Right, said Homer Wells, from the other room. He was still thinking about Dr. Larch's account of Homer's heart history. Physical examinations were given only to people who were Class I. Homer Wells was Class 4. According to his family physician, Homer had congenital pulmonic stenosis. Homer's family physician was Dr. Larch, whose letter to the local medical advisory board had been accepted as evidence enough for Homer's deferment. Larch was also a member of the local board. I asked her to marry me, but she refused, Wally told Homer in their shared bedroom. She said she would wait for me, but she wouldn't marry me. She said she would be my wife, but not my widow. Is that what you call waiting and seeing? Homer asked Candy the next day. Yes, Candy said. I was going to marry Wally. You came along second. I have to wait and see about you. And now comes the war. I have to wait and see about the war, too. But you made him a promise, said Homer Wells. Yes, Candy said. Isn't a promise like waiting and seeing? Did you ever make a promise, and mean it, and break it? Homer Wells suddenly remembered Melanie. They sent Wally to Fort Meade, Maryland, for the month of January. He was a faithful but terrible letter writer. He wrote to his mother, he wrote to Homer and to Candy, and even to Ray, but he never explained anything. If there was a plan to what they were teaching him, Wally either didn't know it or couldn't describe it. He simply wrote in detail about the last thing that had occupied his mind before beginning the letter. Wally was sent to St. Louis, the Jefferson Barracks, Flight 17, 28th School Squadron. It struck Homer Wells that the Army Air Corps had a similar structure to Gray's Anatomy. There were many categories and everything had a name. It was reassuring to Homer Wells. In his mind, this endless categorizing made Wally safer, but Homer couldn't convince Candy of this. "He's safe one minute, and in another minute he's not safe," she said, shrugging. "Look after Homer, look after his heart," Wally had written her. "And who's looking after my heart?" "Yes, I'm still angry," she wrote him, although he hadn't asked. But if she was angry with Wally, she was also loyal. She was keeping her promise about the waiting and seeing. She kissed Homer when she saw him, and when they said goodbye, but she didn't allow him anything else. "We're just good friends," she told her father. Ray hadn't asked. "I can see that," Ray said. One day when Homer was working in an orchard, Vernon Lynch told him, "If I was your age, I'd go to war. I'd do what Wally's doing." "I can't," said Homer Wells. "Is it because they don't take orphans?" Vernon asked. "No," Homer said. "I have a heart defect. I was born with it." Vernon Lynch was not a gossip, but that was all that Homer needed to say. The workers at Ocean View not only forgave Homer for not joining the army, they even began to take care of him. And in the early spring, when it was time to mend the boxes for the beehives, Ira Titcomb rushed to assist Homer, who was struggling with a particularly heavy pallet. "Don't strain yourself, Jesus," Ira said. "I can manage, Ira." "I'm stronger than you are," Homer said, not understanding, at first, Ira's concern. "I have heard that your heart is not very strong," Ira said. On Mother's Day, Vernon Lynch taught him how to operate the sprayers. He insisted on giving Homer another lecture on the use of the respirator. "You of all people," Vernon told him, "should keep this thing on, and keep it clean." Even Deborah Pettigrew forgave him for his strange friendship with Candy. As the weather warmed up, they went parking again and gave each other kisses in the Pettigrew's unoccupied summer house on Drinkwater Lake. When Homer's kisses calmed down, Deborah grew impatient. When his were too passionate, Deborah said, "Careful. Don't get too excited." It was spring. Wally was sent to Kelly Field, San Antonio, Texas, for Air Corps Cadet Training Squadron 2, Flight C, and in the summer they moved him from San Antonio to Coleman, Texas. "I wish someone would declare war on Texas," he wrote to Homer. "That might be an excuse for being here." He wrote that he was flying in his undershorts and socks, that was all that any of them could wear in such heat. Where does he think he could go? Candy complained to Homer. Does he expect a perfect climate? He's going to a war. Homer was sitting opposite her on Ray Kindle's dock. In the cool classroom at Cape Kenneth High, Homer often unrolled the map of the world. He used the summer solitude to study the places of the world where Wally could go. Even the migrants were different that harvest, they were both older and younger, all the rest went to war, except for Mr. Rose. That harvest there was a woman whom Mr. Rose called Mama, although she wasn't old enough to be any of their mothers. She only obeyed Mr. Rose. Homer knew this because the woman did what she wanted to do. She cooked a little, but she was not the cook every night, and she was not everyone's cook. Some nights she even sat on the roof, but only when Mr. Rose sat there with her. She was a tall, heavy young woman, and she wore a nearly constant smile copied from Mr. Rose. It surprised Homer that she had her own bed, next to Mr. Rose, but no attempt was made to separate their beds with curtains to construct a little privacy. Sometimes, when Homer drove by the cider house, he noted that everyone except Mr. Rose and his woman was either standing outside the house or sitting on the roof. They kept Wally in Texas, yet they moved him once more, to Lubbock Flying School. The Army Air Corps had promised to send him home for Christmas. "Soon I will be in the bosom of my family," he wrote to Candy, and Homer, and Olive, and even to Ray, who had contributed to the war effort by building torpedoes. He had hired some local boys who were still in school to help him keep his lobster business, and he worked on the vehicles at Ocean View on the weekends. He enthusiastically demonstrated the gyroscope on Olive's kitchen table to Olive and Homer Wells. "Before a fellow can understand how the torpedo works," Ray liked to say, "he has to understand the gyroscope." Homer was interested, Olive was polite, and what's more, completely dependent on Ray. If he didn't fix all the machinery at Ocean View, Olive was convinced that the apples would stop growing. Candy was cross much of the time. Everyone's war effort depressed her, although she had volunteered to work long hours at Cape Kenneth Hospital as a nurse's aide. She also convinced Homer that he could be a more useful nurse's aide than most. "Right," Homer said. Homer soon found that he felt comfortable there. However, it was at times difficult to refuse to give his expert opinion on certain subjects and to play the role of a beginner. Even the nurses looked down on the nurses' aides, and Homer was irritated to see that the doctors looked down on everyone, most of all, on their patients. Candy and Homer were not allowed to give injections or medication, but they had to make beds, empty bedpans, give baths. They were given delivery room duties. For example, Homer was unimpressed with the obstetrical procedure he saw there. In Street Clouds, Homer had seen many patients who were so lightly etherized that they could talk throughout their own operations. In Cape Kenneth's recovery rooms, The patients looked awful. It especially angered Homer to see how they dosed the children, as if the doctors or the anesthetists were so uninformed that they didn't consider the patient's body weight. One day he sat with Candy on either side of a 5-year-old boy who was recovering from a tonsillectomy. That was nurse's aide work. You sat with the patient coming out of ether, especially the children, especially the tonsillectomies. They were often frightened and in pain and sick when they woke. Homer said they would feel better if they had been given a little less ether. One of the nurses was in the recovery room with them. It was the one they liked, a girl about their age. Her name was Carolyn, and she was nice to the patients and tough to the doctors. "You know a lot about ether, Homer," Nurse Carolyn said. "They overuse it here, in certain cases," Homer mumbled. "Hospitals aren't perfect," Nurse Carolyn said. "And doctors aren't perfect, either, they just think that they are." "Right," said Homer Wells. The 5-year-old boy's throat was very sore when he finally woke up. He vomited. One of the things the nurse's aides did was to be sure that the children, in such condition, didn't choke on their own vomit. Homer explained to Candy that it was very important that the child not aspirate, or inhale, any fluid such as vomit into the lungs. "Aspirate," Nurse Carolyn said. "Was your father a doctor, Homer?" "Not exactly," said Homer Wells. Nurse Carolyn introduced Homer to young Dr. Harlow. "Oh, yes, Wells, our ether expert," Dr. Harlow said snidely. "I grew up in an orphanage," said Homer Wells. "I did a lot of helping out around the hospital." "But surely you never gave an ether?" said Dr. Harlow. "Surely not," lied Homer Wells. As Dr. Larch had discovered with the Board of Trustees, it was especially pleasant to lie to unlikable people. "Don't show off," Candy told Homer when they were driving back to Heart's Haven together. "It could get your Dr. Larch in trouble." "When did I show off?" Homer asked. "You really haven't shown off yet," Candy said. "Just don't do it, okay?" Homer sulked. "And don't sulk," Candy told him. "I'm just waiting and seeing," said Homer Wells. "You know how that is." He let her out at the Lobster Pound. He usually came in with her and chatted with Ray. But Homer confused Candy's irritability with coldness toward him. She slammed the door and walked around to his side of the van before he could drive away. She asked him to roll down his window. Then she leaned inside and kissed him on the mouth. She banged her head on the window frame when she pulled herself back from him. Her eyes were watery. "Do you think that I'm having a good time?" she asked him. "Do you think that I'm teasing you?" Do you think that I know whether I want you or Wally? He drove back to Cape Kenneth Hospital. He needed work more important than mousing. It was the mousing season again. How he hated handling the poison. He arrived at the same time with a sailor who was cut in a knife fight. The sailor's friends had driven him to the hospital. While driving, they lost their way and went past several hospitals. The cut between the sailor's thumb and forefinger extended nearly to the sailor's wrist. Homer helped Nurse Carolyn wash the wound with ordinary white soap and sterile water. "Take his blood pressure, opposite arm," he said to Nurse Carolyn, "and put the blood pressure cuff on over a bandage, to protect the skin," he added, because Nurse Carolyn was staring at him curiously. "The cuff has to be on there for a half hour or more," said Homer Wells. "I think I can give instructions to Nurse Carolyn, if you don't mind," Dr. Harlow said to Homer. Both the doctor and his nurse stared at Homer Wells in amazement. "Very neat job, Wells," Dr. Harlow said. "The knife had entered on the side of the palm," observed Homer Wells. He remembered his Grays, and he remembered the movie he had seen with Deborah Pettigrew, the cavalry officer with the arrow in his hand, the arrow that fortunately missed the branch of the median nerve that goes to the muscles of the thumb. He watched the sailor move his thumb. Dr. Harlow was looking. "There's a very important branch of the median nerve," Dr. Harlow said slowly, to the sailor. "You're lucky if that's not cut." "The knife missed it," said Homer Wells. "Yes, it did," said Dr. Harlow, looking up from the wound. "How do you know?" "You are not only an ether expert, I see," said Dr. Harlow, still snidely. "You know all about muscles, too." "Just about that one," said Homer Wells. "I used to read Gray's Anatomy, for fun," he added. "For fun?" said Dr. Harlow. "I suppose you know all about blood vessels, then. Why not tell me where all this blood is coming from?" Despite Candy's certain disapproval, Homer answered. "The blood vessel is a branch of the palmar arch," he said. "Very good," said Dr. Harlow, disappointed. "And what would you recommend I should do about it?" "Tie it," said Homer Wells. "Precisely," said Dr. Harlow. "You didn't get that from Gray's." He pointed out to Homer Wells that the knife had also cut the tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus 1 and the flexor digitorum sublimis 2. "And where might they go?" he asked Homer Wells. "To the index finger," Homer said. "Is it necessary to repair both tendons?" asked Dr. Harlow. "I don't know," said Homer Wells. "I don't know a lot about tendons," he added. "How surprising." said Dr. Harlow. It is only necessary to repair the profundos, he explained. And then I'd recommend a pressure dressing on the palm. You'll want to curve the fingers a little bit around the dressing, Homer said. That's called the position of function, Dr. Harlow said. I don't know what it's called, Homer said. Were you ever in medical school, Wells? Dr. Harlow asked him. Not exactly, said Homer Wells. Do you plan to go? Dr. Harlow asked. It's not likely, Homer said. He tried to leave the operating room then, but Dr. Harlow called after him. Why aren't you in the service? He asked. I've got a heart problem, Homer said. I don't think you know what it's called, said Dr. Harlow. Right, said Homer Wells. He went and read some stories to the tonsillectomy patients. They were all stupid stories. Children's books didn't impress Homer Wells. But the tonsillectomy patients wouldn't like to hear David Copperfield or Great Expectations. Olive was not home when Homer returned to Ocean View. Homer was alone in the house. I could learn a lot of things, he was thinking. And I can learn everything about apple farming. But what he already knew, was almost perfect obstetrical procedure and the much easier procedure, which was against the rules. He thought about rules. That sailor with the slashed hand had not been in a knife fight that was according to anyone's rules. In a fight with Mr. Rose, there would be Mr. Rose's own rules, whatever they were. Mr. Rose was an artist. The real cider house rules were Mr. Rose's. And what were the rules at Street Clouds? What were Larch's rules? Which rules did Dr. Larch observe, which ones did he break, or replace, and with what confidence? Clearly, Candy was observing some rules, but whose? And did Wally know what the rules were? And did Melanie obey any rules? Wondered Homer Wells. Wally had trouble coming back from Texas. There were a series of delays, and bad weather. The landing field was closed. When Homer and Candy picked him up in Boston, the first thing he told them was that he had only 48 hours. He was still happy, however. Second Lieutenant Worthington, Wally announced to Olive. Everyone cried, even Ray. Homer wondered when Wally would want to be alone with Candy and how they would manage it. Surely, he wants to manage it, Homer thought. And Homer didn't know if she wanted to manage it, too. For Christmas Eve, everyone was together. Olive was home, and Ray wasn't building torpedoes or pulling lobster traps. And the day after Christmas, Candy and Homer had to take Wally back to Boston. Oh, Candy and Wally hugged and kissed a lot, everyone could see that. On Christmas night, in Wally's bedroom, Homer realized that he'd been so glad to see Wally that he'd forgotten to send Dr. Larch anything, not even a Christmas card. Ray went early to build the torpedoes, and Homer observed that Wally left Ocean View at about the same time. Homer spent the early morning with Olive. 48 hours is not what I'd call coming home, she said. He hasn't been here for a year, does he call this a proper visit? Does the Army call it a proper visit? Candy and Wally came to pick up Homer before noon. Homer imagined that they had managed it. But how does one know such things without asking? Do you want me to drive? Homer asked. Why? Wally asked. Maybe you want to hold hands, Homer said. Candy looked at him. We've already held hands, Wally said, laughing. But thank you, anyway. Candy did not look amused, Homer thought. So you've done it, you mean? Homer Wells asked them both. Candy stared straight ahead, and Wally didn't laugh this time. What's that, old boy? He asked. I said, so you've done it, had sex, I mean, said Homer Wells. Jesus, Homer, said Wally. That's a fine thing to ask. Yes, we've done it, had sex, Candy said, still looking straight ahead. I hope you were careful, Homer said, to both of them. I hope you took some precautions. Jesus, Homer. Wally said. Yes, we were careful, Candy said. Now she stared at him, her look was as neutral as possible. Well, I'm glad you were careful, Homer said, speaking directly to Candy. You should be careful, having sex with someone who's about to fly over Burma. Burma? Candy turned to Wally. You didn't say where you were going, she said. Is it Burma? I don't know where I'm going, Wally said irritably. Jesus, Homer, what's the matter with you? I love you both, said Homer Wells. If I love you, I've got a right to ask anything I want, I've got a right to know anything I want to know. It was, as they say in Maine, a real conversation stopper. They rode almost all the way to Boston in silence, except that Wally said, trying to be funny, I don't know about you, Homer. You're becoming very philosophical. I love you both, too, you know, Wally said, saying goodbye. I know you do, Homer said. On the way home, Candy said to Homer Wells, I wouldn't say philosophical, I would say eccentric. You're becoming very eccentric, in my opinion. and you don't have a right to know everything about me, whether you love me or not. You have to know for yourself if you really love him, Homer said. Do you love Wally? I've grown up loving Wally, Candy said. I have always loved Wally, and I always will. Fine, Homer said. That's all, then. But I don't even know Wally, anymore, Candy said. I know you better, and I love you, too. Homer Wells sighed. So we should wait and see again, he thought. And Wally went to Victorville, California, Advanced Flying School. U.S. Army Air Forces, that is what his envelope said. Wally spent several months in Victorville. Shortly after apple blossom time, Wally was sent to India. They made him a captain. Wally had won the best name for a plane competition. He named his own plane Opportunity Knox. The painted fist under the inscription looked very impressive. He flew the India, China route, over the Himalayas, over Burma. He carried gasoline and bombs and artillery and rifles and ammunition and clothing and aircraft engines and spare parts and food to China. He brought military personnel back to India. It was a 7-hour flight, about 500 miles. For 6 of the hours he wore an oxygen mask. They had to fly so high. Over the mountains, they flew high because of the mountains. Over the jungles, they flew high because of the Japanese. When he left Assam, the temperature was 40 degrees above zero. They wore just their shorts and socks. The heavily loaded transports needed to rise to 15,000 feet in 35 minutes. At 9,000 feet, Wally put on his pants. At 14,000, he put on the fleece-lined suit. It was 20 degrees below zero up there. They called that aerial route the lifeline. They called it flying over the hump. That summer of 194, they closed the Cape Kenneth Drive-In Theater, because it was necessary to use the minimum of shore lights. Mr. Rose informed Olive that he would be unable to provide a picking crew for the harvest. Considering the men who are gone, he wrote. Homer Wells was cutting the grass when the news came to him. He didn't hear what Candy was yelling when she jumped out of the van and ran to him. Olive was driving, her face was like a stone. Shot down. Candy was screaming, when Homer finally switched off the mower. He was shot down, over Burma. Over Burma, said Homer Wells. He held the sobbing girl in his arms.